All taken apart on the bench here is a circa 1920's Robbins Myers 3-speed oscillating desk fan. I thought since we were waiting on parts for some of the electronic restorations to come in that we'd take a whole fan apart and see what we can do with it. Now the main reason I have this fan apart is to replace the head wire that runs from the base of the fan up to the motor assembly. Now, since this is a 3-speed fan, that means we have a 4-conductor head wire, one lead being the common lead and the other 3 leads corresponding to the various motor speeds. And the original head wire on this fan was just crumbling and brittle and just totally unacceptable. And here's the front of the motor assembly. The head wire entered in through the back of the motor, and the insulation was so brittle that actual bare wire was touching the stator assembly, which is totally unacceptable. I find that in a lot of these old fans, people will actually make an attempt to replace the head wire, but they'll splice onto the old wire just as it enters the motor, but you've still got the old crumbling wire going up into the motor, which is still a hazard. And so in other words, you need to replace the wire and have it fixed where nothing shorts out to anything. You don't need to have any old wire remaining if at all possible. Now before you start cutting wires, you need to take note of where everything connects, and you should make ohm meter measurements to get your various resistance measurements of the different windings, so that way you know what's what, and I've already done that. And we have these nice brand new spools of hookup wire here that we're going to use, as well as some heat shrink tubing. And then once that's all done, I'll have to find some kind of period correct looking black sleeving to slip all over the wire so it'll look better. Okay, let's get started on this and see if we can make this fan run again. Somehow I think this fan stands a better chance of running again over that piece of crap Chinese Lakewood fan that we junked out a few videos ago. Okay, we now have our 4 lead wires cut, stripped, and tinned, and I've chosen to use white for the common lead. And here's our cable all made up and ready to go. As you can see, I tied a knot off here to keep from accidentally pulling the cable out through the back of the motor and possibly ripping these wires out. And I also slid a couple of pieces of heat shrink tubing, one smaller piece and then another larger piece to fit over the first piece over this cable here. And that will help protect the insulation as well as give this wire a tighter fit here so it won't be wiggling around. I want this to be as tight as possible because we want the least amount of strain on these wires as possible. And then what we'll do, we'll slide a small piece of heat shrink tubing over each lead and solder the appropriate lead to appropriate wire lead here to these connections here. Slide the heat shrink down over the soldered connection and heat the heat shrink tubing so it can't slide off, and it should be good to go. So we just pull this down here like so. There we go. And here's our common lead connected. As you can see, we ran a small piece of heat shrink tubing over the lead that runs up into the motor, and we have a larger piece of heat shrink tubing over our new head wire. And since this connection is soldered, we'll just slip this piece of heat shrink over this connection and heat it so it'll stay in place, and that'll take care of that wire. And then we'll do the remaining 3 leads in a similar fashion. And here we go. Lead number 1 taken care of. And by the way, I'm really not too concerned about heat from the motor possibly melting any of this insulation. it seems these older fans don't get nearly as hot as these more modern Chinese pieces of crap. So I think we're okay in that department. Now, down to the next 3 leads, and then we'll put it all back together and see what happens. And here we are, all fixed up and hopefully ready to go. I've heat shrinked all the wires and everything's soldered, so it should be in good shape there. And just for added stability, I used a couple of cable ties to tie this off, and these ties have a temperature rating that should be sufficient. And I also put a tie down here to help prevent the possibility of this lead getting pushed back into the motor and possibly disturbing the connections. So this should be good to go for another 90 years. Okay, time to put it all back together and see what happens. Okay, we have everything wired back up and put together. And now it's time for a test. It's either going to run or it's going to crash and burn. And there it goes. I don't know what that racket is. Sounds like something in the gearbox. But the main thing is the motor's running. Okay, we're getting closer to the desired goal. Here's the switch assembly, and the next thing I need to do is insulate this switch lever, which is metal. I think at one time it had a piece of rubber over it. Otherwise this would be hot, and we don't want that to happen. And here are the connections that fit over the various switch terminals, and I'm going to attach those to our new lead head wire. And then we'll put this thing all back together and do a little cleanup on it, and we should be ready to go. And here's the big old switch out of the fan, and I've cleaned the contacts on it to help it make better connection. I want to tell you, you're not going to see a switch like this in a modern Chinese Walmart fan. Now this is a switch right here. And now all wire connections have been made. The power cord has been replaced. And believe it or not, I used the old power cord that was salvaged from that Lakewood fan that we junked out a while back. And this fan is going to need to undergo a cosmetic restoration, but that will take place on another day. And at that time, I will find something to slide over this head wire to make it look more authentic. Okay, now let's finagle and put all this back together and give it a test run. And here it is all put back together. And a couple of things I've noticed. It still makes a little rubbing sound that I'm going to have to investigate further whenever I take it apart to do the cosmetic restoration. And there's not much difference between high and low speed. But it runs. You can tell there's not a whole lot of difference between the speeds. Which I think some of these old fans will like that. There you go, my 1920's Robbins Myers fan. Back in running condition after probably close to 90 years. Okay, thanks for watching and more to come later.